It was a chilly winter evening on January 18, 1986, at Saddleback College in Mission Viejo, California. The campus, usually bustling with activity, was now quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps echoing through the dimly lit parking lots. A security guard, making his rounds, drove past a figure lying on the ground in one of the student parking lots along the western perimeter of the campus. At first, he thought it might be a mannequin left behind as a prank by some mischievous students. The poorly lit parking lot made it difficult to tell for sure, but something about the scene nagged at him. Moments later, the security guard turned his car around and headed back to the nearly deserted area where the figure lay. As he stepped out of his vehicle, he approached the figure cautiously, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. The figure was lying next to a Chevrolet Citation, and as he drew closer, he saw that it was lying in a pool of blood. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This was no mannequin. It was the dead body of a young woman. Two students, on their way to their cars, also stumbled upon the gruesome scene. They recognized the young woman as Robin Brandley, a 23-year-old communications major who had just left a party in the Fine Arts building. Brandley had volunteered as an usher at a music recital earlier that evening, and the party had followed immediately after. She had been wearing a long print dress with flower designs, but now it was pulled up above her stomach, revealing her bikini underwear and knee-high stockings. A purse, later confirmed to be hers, lay on the pavement nearby, surrounded by the asphalt wet with her blood. Detective Michael Stephanie of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was among the first to arrive at the scene. He observed that Brandley had been stabbed numerous times, mostly in her neck, chest, and back. The sheer brutality of the attack was evident. She had sustained deep defensive wounds on her hands, a testament to her desperate struggle for life. Yet despite the carnage, there was little evidence to go on. No DNA, fingerprints, hair, or clothing fibers were found at the crime scene. The only clue was the body itself and the wounds that told a story of unbridled violence. The autopsy would later reveal that Brandley had been stabbed 41 times, a number that spoke to the intense rage and savagery of her killer. But for now, the detectives were left with nothing but questions and the haunting image of a young life brutally cut short. The case would remain a mystery for the next 11 years. A cold and unforgiving shadow that hung over the campus and the community. On July 17, 1988, the streets of Cathedral City in Riverside County were alive with the usual hustle and bustle. But for Julie McGee, a 29-year-old prostitute, this night would be her last. She was picked up by an unknown male, and her disappearance marked the beginning of a terrifying and tragic sequence of events. Days turned into weeks, and the search for McGee yielded nothing but silence. It wasn't until her remains were found in a remote desert area that the true horror of her fate became clear. The body, stripped of any identification, had been ravaged by coyotes and possibly other animals, making it a gruesome challenge to identify her. However, one clue stood out. Cartridge cases for a .45 caliber handgun were discovered near her body. Initially, McGee's slaying was investigated as a single, isolated homicide, but little did the investigators know that this was just the beginning of a sinister trail of murders. 2 months later, on September 25, 1988, another prostitute, Mary Ann Wells, 31, met a similar fate. She was picked up in nearby San Diego County and driven to a deserted industrial complex within the city of San Diego. Her body was found later, shot once in the head. The scene was eerily familiar. A cartridge case was left behind, just like in McGee's case. A condom found at the scene contained Wells' DNA and that of another person, believed to be the killer's, but this DNA did not immediately lead to any suspects. The months that followed were marked by an unsettling calm, but the tranquility was short-lived. On April 16, 1989, another prostitute, Tammy Irwin, 20, was picked up and driven to a remote area near Palm Springs. Her body was found later, shot 3 times, and dumped in a desolate location. Once again, investigators found cartridge cases near the body, a chilling repetition of the previous crimes. It was at this point that investigators from Riverside and San Diego counties began to see the links between the deaths. The ballistics tests revealed a haunting truth. The cartridge cases from the McGee, Wells, and Irwin murder scenes all matched. Each of the women had been killed with the same gun, a .45 caliber handgun that seemed to be the signature of a serial killer. But despite this crucial evidence, the investigators still lacked the weapon and, more importantly, a suspect to whom they could link these heinous crimes. The realization that they were dealing with a serial killer sent a shiver down the spines of the investigators. They knew they had to act swiftly to prevent more lives from being lost, but the killer remained elusive, leaving behind only the cold, calculated evidence of his crimes. The hunt for the killer had begun, but it would take years of relentless pursuit before justice would finally catch up with him. For 3.5 years, the silence was deafening. There were no more murders that the police could attribute to the same killer who had brutally taken the life of Robin Brandley, a college student stabbed 41 times in a parking lot at Saddleback College. The contrasts between Brandley's murder and the prostitute shootings were too stark. Brandley was not a prostitute, and she had been stabbed, not shot. It seemed as though the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the haunting memories of his previous crimes. But on September 27, 1992, in Palm Springs, California, a new chapter in this dark saga began to unfold. Jennifer Asbenson, a 19-year-old nursing assistant, was on her way to work the night shift at a home for disabled children. She had missed the last bus of the night and was in a panic, knowing she had no way to get to her job on time. As she stood at the bus stop, a man pulled up in his car and offered her a ride. He seemed like a good Samaritan, charming and non-threatening, so she accepted without hesitation. Asbenson recalled that she didn't feel any sense of fear as she got into the car. The man dropped her off at work in time for her shift, which ran from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. She thought nothing of the encounter, believing him to be genuinely kind. The next morning, as Asbenson finished her shift, the same man was waiting outside the children's home. He offered her a ride home, and despite some reservations, she accepted once more. After all, if he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so the night before. But this time, things took a drastic turn. As soon as she was inside the car, the man's demeanor changed. He put a knife to her throat, tied her hands behind her back, and drove her into the desert. The isolation and darkness of the desert only intensified Asbenson's nightmare. He cut off her shorts and bra, shoved her underwear into her mouth, and forced her to perform sexual acts. He tried to strangle her until she passed out, only to revive her and force her into the car's trunk. Convinced that she was going to die, Asbenson's survival instincts kicked in. She desperately searched for the trunk's release mechanism, waiting for the perfect moment to escape. When she found it, she waited until the car slowed down and then jumped out onto the road. Several cars passed her by, but she stood in the road, determined to stop the next vehicle. It was a Marine truck that finally came to a halt, and when her abductor saw the Marines helping her, he fled. The Marines drove Asbenson to safety, and she reported her terrifying ordeal to the police. It was a harrowing experience that would leave her with deep scars. But it was also a testament to her strength and resilience. 2.5 years had passed since the last known murder in the Palm Springs area, but on March 11, 1995, the elusive serial killer struck again. Denise Maney, a 32-year-old prostitute from Riverside County, was picked up from a street and driven to a remote desert area. The isolation of the desert was a perfect setting for the killer's sinister intentions. According to police and court records, Maney was forced to disrobe, and then her hands were tied behind her back. The killer's actions were methodical and brutal. He sexually assaulted Maney before placing a .45 caliber gun in her mouth and pulling the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the desert, and Maney's life was brutally cut short. Following his modus operandi, the killer took her clothes with him, leaving her body in the desert to be discovered later. The killer's trail of terror seemed to have ended in California, but it was only a temporary lull. Halfway across the nation, in Cook County, Illinois, another prostitute would fall victim to his cruelty. On April 14, 1996, Laura Wilaki was picked up off the street and driven to the Wolf Lake area, straddling the Hammond, Indiana and Chicago border. The ordeal ended with Oilaki being shot twice in the head with a .38 caliber revolver. Her nude body was thrown into Wolf Lake, where it was later found on the Chicago side. Police theorized that the killer had taken her clothing and other items to hinder identification, but at this point, they did not connect this murder with those in California. 3 months later, on July 14, 1996, the killer struck again in Illinois. Cassandra Cassie Coram, a 21-year-old prostitute, was found floating in the Vermilion River in Livingston County, near the town of Pontiac. Her body told a gruesome story. Duct tape covered her mouth, she had been shot once in the head, and an autopsy revealed she had been stabbed 7 times in the chest and head. Her wrists were handcuffed, and duct tape bound her ankles. Coram had disappeared from a bar in Hammond, Indiana, after conversing with a man and leaving with him in his pickup truck. The following month, on August 2, 1996, another body was discovered in Wolf Lake, just a few yards from where Oilaki's body had been found earlier. Lynn Huber, a 22-year-old prostitute from Chicago, was found floating in the lake. Like most of the other victims, Huber had been left nude, with no clothing or identification nearby. The killer's pattern was clear. He targeted vulnerable women, subjected them to unspeakable horrors, and then discarded their bodies in remote areas. The killer's identity remained a mystery, but the trail of bodies and the consistent modus operandi hinted at a serial killer who had no qualms about crossing state lines to claim his victims. On November 14, 1996, Hammond, Indiana Patrol Officer Warren Fryer was on routine patrol when he noticed a pickup truck parked outside a suspected crack house on the 800 block of Becker Street. The driver, a man later identified as Andrew Urdiales, 31, was sitting with a prostitute known to the police. Fryer's instincts told him something was off, so he called for backup and waited for additional officers to arrive before approaching the vehicle. As the officers approached the pickup, Urdiales seemed cooperative, explaining that he had served in the Marines. However, Fryer's attention was drawn to a revolver inside the truck, prompting him to yell loudly, "Gun!" to alert his fellow officers. The revolver, a snub-nosed, chrome-plated .38 Special, was retrieved and found to be fully loaded with 6 bullets. Since Urdiales did not have a permit for the gun, he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon, and the revolver was confiscated. As the pickup was being prepared to be towed, Fryer and the other officers were struck by the vehicle's immaculate condition. The truck bed and cab were spotlessly clean, almost as if they had just come out of the showroom. Rolls of duct tape were also discovered inside the vehicle, a detail that would later prove significant. Urdiales was soon released on the concealed weapon charge, but was later convicted of a misdemeanor for the unauthorized possession of a handgun. It seemed like just another minor incident, but little did anyone know that this was only the beginning of unraveling a much larger and more sinister story. Months later, on April 1, 1997, Officer Fryer received a call about a man and a woman fighting at the American Inn Motel at 4000 Calumet Avenue in Hammond. The man was none other than Andrew Urdiales again. According to police, Urdiales claimed that the woman, a prostitute, had stolen something from him. However, the prostitute told a different story. She described Urdiales as kind of kinky, and revealed that the altercation had arisen because Urdiales had wanted to take her to Wolf Lake, handcuff her in the back of his pickup, and have sex with her. Fryer's response was immediate and grave. "Geez, don't do that. We're finding girls up there dead." This comment was more than just a warning. It was a hint at the dark reality that was about to unfold. Fryer wrote a police report about the incident and filed it, but he did not arrest Urdiales or the woman. Instead, he decided to dig deeper into Urdiales' past. He ran a computer check on Urdiales, which included all known infractions involving him in Hammond, including the November 1996 incident where Urdiales was caught with an unauthorized handgun. Fryer then wrote a supplemental report that included all the information he knew about Urdiales to date and forwarded it to the detective division. The connection to the murdered prostitutes at Wolf Lake was too significant to ignore. Copies of the reports were forwarded to homicide detectives with the Chicago Police Department, CPD, in the hope that the information might be useful to them. Detective Don McGrath, upon reviewing the documents, asked Hammond police for Urdiala's confiscated revolver. When McGrath received the weapon, he took it to a gun expert for a thorough examination. The ballistics test results were conclusive. The revolver was the same gun used to kill Laura Wielocki, Cassandra Coram, and Lynn Huber. McGrath now knew for certain that he had a serial killer on his hands. On the morning of April 22, 1997, McGrath and his partner, Detective Raymond Krakowski, began a stakeout in an alley near Urdiala's parents' home. It was a working-class neighborhood where unassuming bungalows and duplexes lined the streets, a place where Urdiales had resided following his discharge from the Marine Corps years earlier. The detectives did not have to wait long. Urdiales emerged at approximately 9 a.m., heading to his job as a security guard at a downtown Chicago Eddie Bauer store. As Urdiales walked out, the two detectives approached him. "We need to speak with you about the incident in November 1996, they said, referring to the confiscated .38 caliber revolver. Urdiales politely told them that the case had been resolved, but the detectives insisted there was unfinished business. After minimal hesitation, he agreed to accompany them to their offices. It was a pivotal moment in the investigation when Detective Don McGrath asked Andrew Urdiales about the origins of his .38 caliber revolver. Urdiales, calm and cooperative, explained that he had purchased the gun about 5 years earlier in Calumet City for $300. He assured the detectives that the gun had never been out of his possession until it was confiscated by Hammond police officers. As the questioning continued, McGrath and his partner, Detective Raymond Krakowski, shifted their focus to the unsolved crimes they were investigating. They mentioned shooting deaths involving a .38 caliber gun and showed Urdiales photos of Laura Wielocki, Cassandra Coram, and Lynn Huber. Initially, Urdiales claimed he did not recognize the women, but when McGrath revealed that the bullets used in their murders matched his gun, Urdiales' demeanor changed. He paused for a moment before responding, "I guess I won't be going to work today." Without any additional prompting, Urdiales also mentioned that there were some matters that police in California might be interested in. This revelation was significant because, up until this point, police in neither state had connected the earlier murders in California to those in Illinois. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, and the true extent of Urdiales' crimes was beginning to unravel. With a sense of resignation, Urdiales took off his security badge, loosened his tie, and began untying his shoelaces. It was as if he had finally accepted the inevitable. He then began to provide the detectives with detailed accounts of his murders, starting with Laura Wielocki. Urdiales explained that he had met Wielocki during the winter of 1996 and that they had gone on a few dates. They had sex on 2 occasions at Wolf Lake, using a sleeping bag he kept in the back of his truck. However, their final encounter in April 1996 ended in tragedy. An argument broke out between them as they drove to Wolf Lake, and Urdiales pulled out his loaded .38 caliber revolver from beneath the driver's seat. In a moment of chaos, the gun went off, shooting a hole in the roof of his pickup. Laura got mad, and all hell broke loose, Urdiales recounted to the detectives. He described how Wielocki had tried to grab the gun, breaking his left index finger in the struggle. As she jumped out of the truck and tried to run away, Urdiales fired a couple of rounds in her direction. After she fell to the ground, he confirmed she was dead and then made the callous decision to toss her body into the lake. Before doing so, he undressed her and took her clothes with him, later throwing them out of the truck on the drive back to Chicago. Urdiales' next confession was about Lynn Huber, his 7th murder victim. He had met Huber during the summer of 1996. She was a prostitute working in Chicago. Like Wielocki, Urdiales and Huber had sex on 2 occasions. On an evening in late July or early August 1996, Urdiales saw Huber carrying a large garbage bag and offered her a ride, which she accepted. The detectives knew that Huber's body had been found on August 2, 1996. Urdiales described how he had driven into an alley where they could have sex. But things took a deadly turn when Huber began arguing with him and tried to get out of the truck. He grabbed her and shot her in the head with the gun he kept under the driver's seat. As the detectives listened intently, Andrew Urdiales continued his chilling confession, detailing the final moments of his victims' lives. After killing Lynn Huber, he placed her body in the bed of his truck and drove to Wolf Lake. As he removed her clothing, he pricked his finger with a needle, an accident that fueled his anger. This minor injury prompted him to take a knife and stab Huber's body multiple times in the back. He then shot her again, ensuring she was dead. With her nude body, he threw her into the lake, leaving behind the gruesome scene. Urdiales also took the garbage bag Huber had been carrying, examined its contents, and found it contained clothing. In a twisted act of callousness, he decided to give all the clothes, including those Huber had been wearing, to the Salvation Army. "Huber won't need them anymore," he coldly explained. The detectives were about to hear the story of Urdiales' eighth and final victim, Cassandra Coram. Urdiales had known Coram for about 2 years before killing her on the night of July 13, 1996. They had met at a bar in Hammond, Indiana, and driven to Wolf Lake to have sex. The next day, Coram's body was found floating in the lake. That evening, something Coram said had angered Urdiales, though he couldn't recall what it was. His anger, a recurring theme in his confessions, led him to strike Coram in the face several times with his hand and fist. Frightened by his violence, Coram panicked and began to fight back, prompting Urdiales to handcuff her hands behind her back. He removed her clothing, describing her as numb with anxiety and fear, and passive and submissive. He bound her feet with duct tape and placed duct tape over her mouth. Still seething from the earlier altercation, Urdiales drove south on Interstate 55 with Coram, terrified and bound, lying on the front seat. After about 2 hours, he grew tired and decided to exit the interstate. He continued driving until he crossed a bridge leading to a small park, where he stopped and shut off the truck's engine. As they got out of the truck, Urdiales grabbed his gun from beneath the seat. Coram, still naked, turned to face him as if she had planned to say something. But before she could speak, Urdiales shot her. After she fell to the ground, Urdiales' anger still simmered. He took out his knife and stabbed her a few times. Finally, he dropped her body into the river from the nearby bridge and threw her clothing out of the window as he drove away. When asked about his feelings, Urdiales claimed he had been trained to kill in the Marine Corps and felt no sympathy for Coram. "She was just a whore," he said, his words devoid of any remorse. Andrew Urdiales was a man shrouded in solitude, described as a loner who struggled to engage in even the simplest of conversations. His high school years at Thornridge High School in Dolton, Illinois, were marked by isolation, earning him the label of social outcast upon his graduation in 1982. With few friends to call his own, Urdiales sought a new path and joined the U.S. Marine Corps shortly after completing high school. For the next 8 years, he was stationed at Camp Pendleton and other locales in Southern California, a period that would shape his future in ways both profound and tragic. During his time in the Marines, Urdiales' personal life was as tumultuous as his professional one. He claimed to have fallen deeply in love with a 15-year-old girl whom he had impregnated. However, the fear of her parents and his reaction and the potential disciplinary actions from the Marine Corps due to her age made marriage an impossible dream. The couple agreed that she would have an abortion, a decision that weighed heavily on Urdiales' heart. "I loved her and still love her," he would later confess to a psychiatry professor at Yale University. But the law and the state of California and the righteous and the Marine Corps might not see it that way. This poignant admission revealed a complex and troubled individual, torn between his emotions and the harsh realities of his world. The shadows of Urdiales' past were deep and dark. Court records and trial testimony would later reveal significant evidence of mental illness on both sides of his family. He had been sexually abused by relatives and physically and emotionally abused by his parents, scars that would forever mar his psyche. Urdiales' military career was marked by both achievement and failure. He received several promotions, but his inability to lead effectively led to his demotion when those under his command refused to obey his orders. The strain of his personal life and the pressures of military service seemed to culminate in a series of horrific crimes. During his time in Southern California, he killed 4 women, acts that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1991, Urdiales received an honorable discharge from the Marine Corps and returned to Chicago to live with his parents. However, his return to California in September 1992 was not without incident. During a short visit, he attacked Jennifer Asbenson, a young woman who would narrowly escape his clutches. Urdiales returned to Chicago once more, but the allure of California's deserts would draw him back again. In March 1995, while vacationing in Palm Springs, Urdiales took the life of Denise Maney, his fifth known California murder victim. It was a fateful evening in January 1986 when Andrew Urdiales, then a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton near San Diego, committed his first murder. Urdiales had been simmering with anger over relationships on the base, and in a moment of twisted resolve, he decided to rob someone. He armed himself with a big old hunting knife, about 11 inches long, and drove to Saddleback College, where he waited in a darkened parking lot for a victim. The victim, he explained, could have been anybody, just a random female. But fate had other plans, and the victim he chose was Robin Brandley, a 23-year-old college student. Urdiales crept up behind her, placing his hand over her mouth and demanding her purse. After she handed it over, he began stabbing her in the back. As she fell to the pavement, Urdiales continued his brutal assault, stabbing her in the chest. At one point, the knife became stuck in her ribs, and he had to place his foot on her body to brace it while he struggled to extract the knife. When he finally finished, Urdiales left Robin Brandley lying there, her life slipping away. With blood on his hands, jacket and jeans, he knew he had to return to the base undetected. He rubbed grease from his car's engine on his hands and clothes to conceal the blood, and told military police at the guard station that his car had broken down and that he'd had to make repairs. It was a lie that would go undetected for years, allowing Urdiales to continue his life as if nothing had happened. But Urdiales' confession to the detectives years later would reveal the chilling details of that night. He also told them about a prostitute he had picked up in Hollywood shortly after the murder. He had sex with her while still carrying the same knife he had used to kill Brandley. That prostitute was lucky, he said. On July 17, 1988, when Andrew Urdiales committed his second murder, he had picked up Julie McGee, a 29-year-old prostitute, in an area frequented by sex workers near Palm Springs, California. The desert landscape, with its vast expanse of nothingness, seemed to be the perfect backdrop for his sinister intentions. Urdiales drove McGee to a remote construction site, a desolate place where the only sounds were the whispers of the wind and the distant hum of crickets. There they had sex, a fleeting moment of intimacy before the brutality that was to come. A short time later, Urdiales told McGee to get out of his car. As she stepped out into the desert night, he shot her in the head, ending her life in an instant. In his confession to the detectives, Urdiales described the scene with a chilling detachment. He claimed he had not felt anything after committing the murder, only commenting on how quiet and peaceful it had been in the desert where he had shot McGee. Afterward, he drove to a bar where he drank beers and watched the girls dance, a stark contrast to the violence he had just perpetrated. 2 months later, on September 25, 1988, Urdiales struck again. This time, his victim was Mary Ann Wells, a 31-year-old prostitute he had picked up in San Diego. He drove her to an industrial area where they had sex, but the encounter ended in tragedy when Urdiales shot Wells in the head and took back the $40 he had paid her. He dumped her body in an alley, leaving behind a condom that would later be found by police. The following spring, on April 16, 1989, Urdiales' killing spree continued. He picked up Tammy Irwin, an 18-year-old prostitute with whom he had had sex before. They drove to a vacant lot near Palm Springs, where Irwin performed oral sex on him. Unlike some of his other victims, Urdiales did not recall arguing with Irwin, but he remembered the moment he shot her. As she stood outside his truck, he fired the first shot from inside the vehicle. She clutched her head, and he shot her again, bringing her to the ground. Before driving off, he shot her a third time, ensuring she would not survive. In one part of Urdiales' confessions to the detectives, he described what happened in September 1992 when Jennifer Asbenson's life intersected with that of Andrew Urdiales. Asbenson, a 19-year-old nursing assistant, had missed her bus to work at a home for disabled children in Cathedral City, California. Desperate to avoid being late, she accepted a ride from a man who seemed like a good Samaritan. After dropping Asbenson off at work, Urdiales asked for her telephone number. She gave him a fake one, hoping to avoid any further contact. However, Urdiales was not deterred. He tried calling the number after dropping her off and became increasingly agitated when he realized it was not real. This minor deception would ignite a chain of events that would nearly cost Asbenson her life. The next morning, Urdiales was waiting for Asbenson outside her workplace, offering her a ride home. Despite her initial reservations, she accepted, thinking that if he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so the night before. But as they drove, Urdiales' demeanor changed dramatically. He became enraged over the fake phone number, his anger boiling over like a pot left unattended. At one point during the drive, Urdiales reached over and grabbed Asbenson by her hair, showing her a gun and rendering her pretty much submissive from that part forward. He tied her hands behind her back, called her a lot of unpleasant names, and kissed her, attempting to make out with her. This was just the beginning of a terrifying ordeal. Urdiales forced Asbenson to perform oral sex on him, but his inability to attain an erection only fueled his rage. He cut off her clothes and undergarments, attempting to sexually assault her, but his failure only made him more livid. He began to choke Asbenson, her body struggling against his grip. She kept kicking, and her saliva was coming out of her mouth. Her face was turning blue and then red. Urdiales recounted to the detectives. It was just a battle for a while. After his hand grew tired from choking her, Urdiales forced Asbenson out of the car, threatening her into another attempt at oral sex. When this failed, he shoved her into the trunk of his car and drove off. Asbenson, convinced she was going to die, desperately searched for the trunk's release mechanism. When she found it, she waited for the right moment and jumped out onto the road. As she stood naked from the waist down, flagging down passing cars, Urdiales' first thought was to shoot her. However, the presence of too many other vehicles on the roadway made him think twice, and he drove away instead. "So that was the last time I saw her," Urdiales told the detectives. "I don't know if somebody else picked her up and finished what I started." However, Asbenson's testimony in court would later contradict Urdiales' version of events. She revealed that Urdiales had indeed been successful in his attempt to sexually assault her after cutting off her clothes. 3 years had passed since the harrowing ordeal of Jennifer Asbenson, who had narrowly escaped the clutches of Andrew Urdiales. In March 1995, Urdiales returned to Palm Springs for a vacation, a trip that would prove to be a deadly one for another unsuspecting victim. He picked up Denise Maney, a 32-year-old prostitute, in the same area where he had previously encountered Julie McGee and Tammy Irwin. The familiarity of the location seemed to embolden Urdiales, and he drove Maney into the desert, seeking the isolation that would allow him to carry out his sinister plans. As they turned off onto a deserted side road, Urdiales ordered Maney to take off her clothes and perform oral sex on him. The desert night was silent, save for the sound of Maney's compliance, driven by fear and coercion. After growing tired of the oral sex, Urdiales' aggression escalated. He grabbed Maney by her hair and forced her to lie face down on the ground in front of his car. Her hands were tied behind her back, and she was forced to perform fellatio again. But Urdiales' satisfaction was fleeting. He wasn't really feeling satisfied, so he continued to abuse her, forcing her onto her knees and subjecting her to anal abuse with his fingers. Maney's screams echoed through the desert, a chilling testament to her suffering. The abuse continued for what seemed like an eternity. And that went on for a while, Urdiales would later recount. "I just kept doing that to her." But eventually, his cruelty reached its climax. Tiring of his brutal assault, Urdiales forced Maney to walk toward the desert. At one point they stopped, and Maney turned around, only to have Urdiales force a gun into her mouth. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. "And then it went off," he related. The bullet blew off the back of Maney's head, and she fell to the ground, still making gurgling noises as she lay dying. Urdiales got back into his car and started to drive away, but something compelled him to return to Maney's lifeless body. "I didn't really think," he said. "I just kind of like wiped clean my hand, and I stopped, turned around, and I went back to her." By this time, he was angry and very upset, and in a fit of rage, he took out his knife. The brutality continued even after Maney's death. Urdiales stabbed her body several times, making slashing motions across her chest and stomach. It was as if he could not stop himself, driven by a madness that seemed to consume him entirely. In the spring of 2002, Andrew Urdiales stood trial in Cook County, Illinois, for the murders of Laura Wielocki and Lynn Huber. The courtroom was a somber setting, filled with the weight of the crimes he had committed. Urdiales was convicted of first-degree murder in both cases, and the verdict was clear. He was sentenced to death. However, fate had other plans. In 2003, just before leaving office, Governor George Ryan commuted all Illinois death sentences, sparing Urdiales from the ultimate penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But Urdiales' legal battles were far from over. In 2004, he faced another trial, this time for the slaying of Cassandra Coram. The outcome was eerily familiar. He was convicted of first-degree murder and received another death sentence. Despite this, Urdiales remained on death row in Illinois, his fate hanging in the balance as he appealed his sentence. Meanwhile, in California, a different chapter of Urdiales' story was unfolding. He would eventually be extradited to face charges in the murders of Robin Brantley, Julie McGee, Marianne Wells, Tammy Irwin, and Denise Maney. However, this would only happen after the evidentiary segment of his appeal in Illinois had concluded. In July 2009, under a state law that allowed for multiple murders connected to one another to be prosecuted together, prosecutors in California decided to consolidate the 5 California murder cases into one. Senior Deputy District Attorney Howard Gundy of the Orange County District Attorney's Office would prosecute the case, ensuring that justice would be sought for all the victims. During Urdiales' sentencing for the murder of Coram, Detective Don McGrath testified about a chilling conversation he had with Urdiales. As he escorted Urdiales back to lockup, Urdiales made a haunting admission. "Well, you know, I'm kind of glad in a way that you caught me," McGrath quoted Urdiales. "I was starting to get the urge again." These words sent a shiver down the spines of everyone in the courtroom, a stark reminder of the danger that Urdiales posed and the relief that his capture brought to the community. On Friday, November 2nd, 2018, the silence of San Quentin State Prison's Adjustment Center was broken by a grim discovery. At around 11:15 p.m., correctional officers conducted a routine security check, only to find Andrew Urdiales, a 54-year-old serial killer, unresponsive in his cell. He was alone, confined to a single cell in the maximum security unit, a place where the shadows of his past crimes seemed to haunt him. As the officers found Urdiales unresponsive, they immediately began CPR. But it was too late. He was pronounced dead at 12:06 a.m. on Saturday, November 3rd, 2018. The apparent cause of death was suicide by hanging, a tragic end to a life marked by violence and cruelty.